guys, so I'm here today to do my August reading wrap up. Now I read quite a lot in August, more than my average, and part of that I think is because I did the booktubeathon, which I read 4 books in the space of a week, which is quite a lot for me, but then I obviously maintained some sort of like reading momentum throughout the month. Now I did do a separate booktubeathon wrap up of the 4 books I read during that readathon, which I will link down below so you can get more in-detailed reviews of those books, but I will mention the 4 books briefly at the end of this video just so you know what they are, if you haven't seen that video already. But instead I'm going to start with the rest of the books I read during the month, and since there's so many, I better get on with it. Now, one that I think you're all going to be curious about, because I talked about it in my currently reading video, is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. This is a retelling of mythological events from ancient Greece. It focuses on the Trojan War between the Trojans and the Greeks, which was initiated by the abduction of Helen. This is unlike any other Trojan War retelling I have read, however, as it's from the perspective of Briseis, who is a Trojan woman who, during the war, before the fall of the actual city of Troy, has her own kingdom and city destroyed and is taken as a slave by the Greek hero Achilles. And it's about how women were affected by the war. It's about how these women were enslaved, how they became possessions, how they became essentially sex slaves, and it really does not shy away from that aspect of it in a way that we very much look at these stories as quite often these tales of mythological greatness and the glory of men, when there was all of these women whose lives were incredibly affected by this war, and in quite horrific ways. They watched all of the male members of their family be killed and then were taken by the men that killed their family as slaves, and it is a hard story to read because it is incredibly emotional, but it is such a wonderful book. I am so pleased that I read this. I'm so pleased that Pat Barker wrote this. I think it's a really important perspective on this situation. I think it's, just a really important story. I loved hearing things from Briseis' perspective. It made me really consider the way in which often Achilles and Briseis' relationship is romanticised in literature and in film, and at the end of the day they did not have an equal relationship. Yeah, it's hard-hitting but incredible, so good, would highly recommend. The next book I want to mention is also a retelling of a Greek myth, so I thought I would keep them together, and that is Liz Lochhead's Medea. Now Liz Lochhead is a Scottish playwright, and in this volume she puts her own stamp on Euripides' Medea, which is an ancient Greek tragedy about the Medea, the princess, the witch of mythology who was married to Jason. Generally speaking, it follows the same events as Euripides' story, but Liz Lochhead puts her own stamp on things. She incorporates the Scots language, mixes the different people up with English and Scots speech to kind of distinguish between them, and you know, it was just a really nice experience of rereading this story in a slightly new way, but still kind of true to the original. And I think these kind of books can just give you a sort of new perspective on those stories. They make you think about it, and I just really enjoyed this, and I really want to read more of Liz Lochhead's plays as well as her retellings of Greek myths, which she has done others of. I am sure this would have been phenomenal to see on stage, but as a reading experience it was still great. Next up I have a collection of poetry, and that is Ghosts Still Waiting by Do Nguyen May, and this is a collection of Vietnamese poetry, obviously in English because I can't read Vietnamese, and it's published by Platypus Press. Now this book is about Vietnam. It's about kind of the poet's perspective on her own country, and it's about the way in which war has affected Vietnam. You've probably all heard of the Vietnamese War, which happened a few decades ago, and it's sort of about the way war affected Vietnam at the time, and kind of the way that has continued to affect the country and the people who live in that country and their memories and their experiences and their families. And it's split into 2 sections with a long poem in the middle. So there are 2 main sections. One is called Smouldering, and then the second main section is called Kindling, with a long poem in the middle called Tongues of Fire. Now, I really enjoyed Tongues of Fire, and I think of the 2 sections, I think Kindling was the most emotive for me. I enjoyed them both, but Kindling in particular really just, you know, made me feel tangible feelings, which is what I want from poetry. So it was a collection that steadily progressed for me, but overall had a really positive reading experience. There's lots of flower imagery that like continues throughout the poems. It's a way that they're sort of strung together, apart from thematically. She uses lots of images of the natural world and flowers, and yeah, I think it was like a really interesting and quite beautiful poetry collection. I did in fact read another poetry collection during the month on my Kindle, and this was Bone by Yrsa Daley Ward. Now this is a collection I'd had on my Kindle for a while. I'd gotten it off NetGalley, which is a site that you can get review copies of books digitally, and this one I'd heard a lot of praise for. I think I initially was interested in it after seeing a video of the author reading one of her poems on the Penguin platform channel, because it is published by Penguin, and I really enjoyed that, so wanted to check it out, but it was sitting there for a while before I managed to get around to it. But once I did, this was a poetry collection I could not put down. I would have read it in one sitting if I hadn't desperately needed sleep the night I started it, but I finished it the next day because I felt very compelled to just read on to the next poem every time I finish one poem, which is kind of exactly the experience I want from a poetry collection. One of the themes in this collection that struck a real chord with me was that of mental health. It deals with mental health themes, and there is a poem particularly near the middle that was just like a real comforting poem, that was a real empowering poem for me, and that was one of the major themes that I enjoyed as a reader. But overall I just enjoyed the rhythm and the reading experience. It deals with loads of themes though. It deals with being a first generation black British woman, it deals with being a woman, women's bodies, relationships, desire, sex, to mental health and abuse, and it just packs a punch, and I was really impressed by this collection and will definitely check out the Poet's Future poetry. The next 3 books were all audiobooks for me though, so I'm going to go through those. Now the first one was a book that I only really finished in August. I started last year, listened to most of initially, then got about 2/3 of the way, got incredibly bored, stopped listening and wasn't sure if I'd actually go back to it, and then decided in August, do you know what, I still want to know what happens at the end, so I went back and I pushed myself to listen to the rest of it so that I could find out the ending essentially. And that is My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier. Now it's funny because when I talked about this one when I started reading it, I was loving this book, which is interesting to show how your opinion can just change midway. I was loving this book, I felt so compelled by the storyline, I wanted to know what was going to happen, I thought it was really intriguing, but there was like a massive dip in it about 2/3 of the way for me. I just felt like nothing was happening and I was getting really bored and disinterested, so I just kind of moved on to other things. But always in the back of my mind I was a little bit curious about how things ended. I wasn't sure how they ended, I hadn't seen the film, so I didn't know what to expect, and I always wanted to kind of just get to the end. So I made that commitment, that time commitment, got to the end, and I think it was a really mixed reading experience, as you can tell from my putting it down, enjoying some of it, not enjoying other bits of it. And I wish I could say I enjoy Daphne du Maurier as much as some people do, but I don't love her as much as some other booktubers do. I've also read Rebecca, and both books I think had their pros for me, and there was aspects of them I enjoyed, but I didn't love either of them. Not sure I'm going to read more Daphne du Maurier, to be honest. I feel like I've given her a real chance. I've not had really terrible reading experiences, but I've also just not felt that inspired by her writing, so I'm not sure I'm going to read anything else. My Cousin Rachel was about a young man whose uncle who raised him has just gotten married abroad but dies before he has a chance to introduce his new wife to his nephew, and instead his new wife comes from Italy to visit the nephew of her now deceased husband, and it's all about like suspicion and like what happened, how did he die, who is this woman Rachel, that kind of thing. Yeah, I obviously lackluster experience, I can't necessarily say run out and read this one, but I know other people adore it, so it just depends on your reading taste. And there is something somewhat satisfying about having just got into that end when I really didn't have that much left to go, and that I've completed it and can have this fully formed opinion, which is always nice. The next audiobook I listened to, however, was Heart of the Fae by Emma Hamm. This is a fantasy novel, and again, it's a fantasy novel with a lot of fae elements in there. There are lots of fairy creatures, and that's something I've been reading a lot of recently when it comes to fantasy, is kind of fae-based fantasy. This is also a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but a very complex, detailed retelling set in its own world. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of fairies in there, which isn't something that is a major plot point in Beauty and the Beast. However, our protagonist, Sorcha, is a young woman who wants to help cure her father and the people in her town, really, of the blood beetle plague, which they can't find a cure for. And she is a healer, she is a midwife in the brothel she lives in, and she also wants to sort of do more than just that. So she sort of ends up making a bargain with the fairies to find a cure for this plague, and they send her on a quest, which takes her to this island that only appears every, now and then. You can't access it regularly, and on it live more fairies, which is where she meets, naturally, the character of the Beast called Eamon, who is a fairy lord. And I ended up really enjoying this book. Now, I'm not gonna lie, there are certainly cheesy moments in there. It is a romance. It's like, you know, the story of Sorcha and Eamon's romance. That is definitely a part of it. So if that's not your cup of tea, you might not like it. But by the end, I was so compelled by this one, I couldn't stop listening. I was so hooked. I just really, really enjoyed it. I just think it kind of like ticked all the boxes for me and was like a really good, fun fantasy read with everything that I could want from it. It also leaves on a bit of a cliffhanger. However, thankfully there is a sequel, and I have downloaded the sequel on my Kindle, so I will be reading that in September and finding out what's next for our character Sorcha. But I ended up really enjoying this one, and I think if you like fantasy, if you like a fantasy romance, if you like fairies, then you will like this story. It's a fun take on the story, and it definitely has its own unique way of telling that story. It's not like a regurgitation of the basic plot. It has a lot going for it that makes it special, and I'll be interested to see what happens in the sequel. So yeah, ended up really enjoying this one, and it just kind of was one I downloaded on a whim to listen to, so I'm glad that I did. And lastly, on audiobook, I also listened to Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal by Jeanette Winterson. So this is Jeanette Winterson's autobiography. So I had recently read in July Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which was Jeanette Winterson's first ever published novel, and that was semi-autobiographical in that it was a fiction novel, but it was very heavily based on Jeanette Winterson's life, and I adored this book. So after adoring that book, I wanted to check out her autobiography because I just kind of wanted more. I remembered how much I adored her writing, and I kind of wanted to know what was real about that story, what wasn't real, and kind of what happened after the events of Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. And I decided to go for the audiobook because it was narrated by Jeanette Winterson, and I always think autobiographies are particularly pleasant to listen to when they are narrated by the person whose life you're hearing about. I think they put all the inclinations and expression in the place they want it to be, and I really enjoy that. And I did enjoy this book, and I didn't love it as much as Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, but that's a difficult book to live up to, and that has the fiction elements of weaving in magical realism and fairy tales that the autobiography doesn't. But overall, I still loved it. Like, I don't want to dampen your inclinations to read it, because I still think it's fantastic. I just think it was difficult in my mind not to compare it to Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. However, if you're somebody that liked Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit but don't like the sporadic inclusion of magical realism, then you'll probably love Why Be Happy You Could Be Normal more, because it doesn't have that. So it's like two sides to a coin. It depends on what kind of reader you are. And I really enjoyed learning more about Jeanette. I felt like, although at the beginning I felt like I wasn't really getting into the author's like emotional experience and she was being quite distant, by the end I felt like she was really letting you in. She seeks out her biological mother, and that's really interesting to read about. She talks about some of the darker moments of her life when she was really finding it difficult to cope, and like the more you hear, I think, and the more recent the stories she's telling are, the more emotional they get, and it was quite an incredible thing to listen to. Although I might say you might benefit from having read Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit first, because she references that book a lot. Now, you'll still be able to listen to the autobiography without having read Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit if you're really not interested in that, but she does reference it a lot, so it was nice to know those references, which I appreciated. Jeanette Winterson grew up in an incredibly religious Pentecostal household. child with her adoptive parents, and as she got older discovered that she had feelings for other girls and that she was gay, and it's about that experience, but also what happened after she grew up, and like I said, seeking out her biological mother and her relationships in the future, and how she dealt with her childhood experience. And yeah, like definitely worth giving a shot. But next I'm just going to tell you the 4 other books I read during the booktubeathon, and if you want reviews of those you can go check out my booktubeathon wrap up. The first one was Antigone, which is an ancient Greek tragic play by Sophocles. I also read Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow, which is a children's fantasy novel. So good. And Misogynation, The True Scale of Sexism by Laura Bates, which is a non-fiction book about misogyny, particularly in the media. And lastly, I listened to the audiobook of Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn Ward, which was also incredible. I had a really good booktubeathon, enjoyed everything I read. In fact, I enjoyed most of the books I read this month, so that's pretty awesome, and I'm looking forward to finding out what I'm going to be reading in September. My TBR for autumn should be up very soon if you're interested, so do look out for that. But I'd love to know your thoughts on any of these books, if you've read them or are interested in reading them, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I love chatting with you, and let me know if you read anything particularly good in August yourself. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!